Hi, welcome to Therapy Rebranded, where we're consistently inconsistent.
Ding.
Today we have our first podcast guest. We're so excited.
We're very excited.
It's Raquel Savage. She's a
I'm your first guest?
Yes.
Ever.
Like ever?
Ever. And we've been saying no to people.
Everybody's like, we're like,
no. No.
Oh my gosh.
No.
No.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course. Therapist, owner of Zep Wellness, sex worker, advocate. Would you add anything else to that?
I think that that's a good start.
Okay. So we just want, honestly, one of the things that we're most interested in is the fact that you're intentionally not licensed. You're clearly very intelligent. You know your shit. We follow your social media. You're very smart. It's very obvious. It's a choice.
Yes.
And so I think it's impressive and brave. I really do. And I wanted to hear more about your decision, like why you decided that. How'd you get there?
Yeah, so honestly, I think that generally, and if you know me, I think you know about me that I'm a pretty rebellious person, and I just want to do what I want to do, and that's it. And I don't really give a fuck about anything else. So I think just that as a starting point or an entry point to the conversation is important. The other piece probably is that I learned very quickly by proxy of being a client of therapy and also in grad school that the folks that I was graduating with and the people who I would consider my peers don't actually give a fuck about people who occupy my identities or Black folks generally, or women generally, or sex workers generally, or disabled people generally. Just any folks who exist in identities that are marginalized are not centered in therapy spaces, not in sincere ways. And so what that means largely is therapists and clinicians are not thinking about how therapeutic practices impact marginalized folks and how a lot of therapeutic practices parallel police. Therapists are cops. And I have a really firm abolitionist politic, and I find that any of the practices that would be expected of me as a licensed therapist would go against my abolitionist politic and would directly harm the populations that I serve specifically and me as a client. And so in practice, what that looks like is I don't do any mandated reporting. I don't do any involuntarily hospitalizing people. I would never do wellness checks by the police. And these are things that licensed clinicians are expected to do. Now, there are also licensed clinicians who choose to opt out of that, and they still have their licensure, and for good reason, because it pays more. But they still are deciding to disrupt those practices for the exact same reasons. And then I just want to also broadly mention that, and we can talk about alternatives to those things, because some people hear that and they're like, oh, so if somebody's getting abused, you just don't do anything. And of course,
extreme. No, I absolutely understand what you're saying. None of that freaks me out. Seem like you have great clinical judgment. I think from my perspective, as soon as you were when I went to grad school, that's how I felt. I went into social work. I think I did a little research on you. You went into the LMFT track, or did you do social?
Yeah. I'm a counselor. Marriage and family therapy is my background.
And I was horrified. And when I say horrified, and I was making white girls cry every other day in class and getting pulled aside and all of these things, because we were having even not just the concepts of the modalities they wanted to use, the interventions, but also the language that they were using to talk about my community was unacceptable. It was absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah.
And when we were in conversation and having these things, it felt like even in grad school, white women and their feelings were being centered more than clients.
And of course,
it's we had the same internship, same clinical year internship, and Jave was going toe to toe with the heads of the organization that were white folks, white femmes, white women, and white male. There's one white male. Who were being hella harmful, specifically around the George Floyd stuff happening. And we live in Minneapolis, so that's right in our backyard. Where we were working was blocks from that happening, and they weren't making a statement about the police. And
they refused because they didn't want to upset the police, and they were we partner with the police, and
we were okay, and
okay, and right. So there's all of this politicalness around we have to tiptoe around these institution systems and their feelings. And so when you say you won't do a wellness check, I mean, I know why, but could you like articulate more for other people why it might be harmful to have a marginalized person or someone in a marginalized community have a police officer show up at their house while they're in crisis
and just regulate you even more?
Yeah, can you share some of that?
Any interventions that involve the state are going to be harmful for people of color or folks who are marginalized, and that includes disabled people, sex workers, any kind of person who is marginalized, period. So whenever I talk to clinicians about moving out of the space of like mandated reporting and wellness checks and involuntarily hospitalizing people, what I ask folks to think about is there is no situation in which you are calling the cops or calling CPS where harm will not be done. So you can minimize harm as much as possible by doing a number of things. But if you move forward with making those calls, you are going to be doing harm to families, to people. And that's because people of color, Black women, disabled folks, sex workers are disproportionately impacted by the state, like, period. So I think that that's something that's important for clinicians to know. And the whole point is that everything that we learn about being a clinician is grounded in white, cis, male, Christian politics. So the understanding generally is that all of this will be good, none of it will be bad, because that's how it would impact them. And in practice and in theory, it would be fine, but that's not who we're working with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And, you know, I think one of the crux of whiteness is that if you follow the rules, everything will work out for you. And they really believe that because a lot of white middle class women, if they follow the rules, it will usually work for them, right? As long as they're not.
But it doesn't, though.
But they think it does because
they buy into it.
Their
but
proximity to whiteness, they don't want to give that up. They would rather be harmed by the patriarchy and the systems in place than to take the risk of giving up the proximity to whiteness.
Absolutely. Yep.
Ooh.
When you talk about cishet men, I think I've heard you on another podcast sharing that you don't really enjoy providing therapy, or maybe don't provide therapy to cishet men. Is that
I don't provide therapy to
tell us.
I don't. I never have. I literally have on my website, my services are not available to cishet men or white people.
Right in both.
Yeah, very, very clearly. I don't serve that population. I'm not interested in serving that population. I just recently created an account where I'm getting clients from an outside source, and I do now have some white clients, because when you put an advertisement on a larger scale, you're just going to get who you're going to get. And so only one person, because now I'm going to have, I changed my intake and I didn't realize that I did. And so the one like slipped through essentially. So now I've updated it so that won't be a problem again. But yeah, I don't, and it's going to be fine. And because the point is, and this is the fucking point. Do I have the capacity to provide therapy to cishet men and white folks? Probably, but I don't want to. And also, I genuinely do believe that I potentially could do harm just by proxy of I'm going to show up in this space as myself. And I think that's another thing with the like whiteness, white supremacy showing up in our like graduate spaces is we're told all the time, leave your biases at the door, don't bring your biases in the room. And I think that's bullshit. The idea that any one of us can be objective, or that objectivity is a thing, is very much so a symptom of white supremacy, because the folks who can occupy objectivity are white cis men. Everybody else, our experiences inform who we are as people, who we are as therapists, the modality that we choose, how we approach clients in terms of building rapport, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm coming into my therapy spaces as a Black queer woman. That's going to show up in everything that I do. And that's also going to show up in how, if I'm sitting across from a cishet man and y'all are doing some bullshit, I'm going to say, you're doing some bullshit. Let's talk about patriarchy. And honestly, I don't even give a fuck if I was getting paid. I don't want to teach a cishet man about patriarchy. That's not my ministry. So yeah, I actively definitely do not work with cishet men. I mostly don't work with white folks. And I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that. And the folks who I do see have no problem with that. And I'm happy to offer competent and unbiased and accessible services to Black queer folks, to Black women, to Black trans folks, to Black sex workers, because that's the population and communities that I care about most.
And to that point, kind of, I know that on your website, and you talk about this like in other interviews that I've watched, of kind of what does it mean to decolonize therapy? And it sounds like, you know, not taking on cishet men, not taking on white folks is a part of that. But what does that kind of mean in your politic, in your like paradigm? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that decolonizing healing spaces for me looks like practicing the way that I practice, which is disrupting the expectations of white supremacists, cis hetero patriarchal graduate programs and licensure boards.
Yeah.
So it means that instead of involuntarily hospitalizing people, it means working with people directly and their communities to build support and crisis plans and figuring out what emergency services they consent to, so that if they are in a crisis, it's not, oh my God, I got to call the police. It's no, they actually chose blah, blah, blah hospital. I'm going to call the hospital because they said that's fine. Or coming up with any kind of support plan with clients that has to do with being dysregulated, or how their communities can show up for them, whether that's in healing spaces or food or rent or whatever the case may be. So I think even just involving people's community is a big disruption of therapy, because therapy is typically done so much in isolation. And there's a whole thing about like, oh, we can't, I don't know, there's just fucking weird expectations that are just so white. And it's like, I want to know who your people are. I literally meet the emergency crisis support people of my clients, and we go over plans together to make sure that they know how to support the clients that I work with. And that makes fucking sense.
Makes all the sense in the world. When you talk about that, you're right. Thank you for circling back to that, because I just got all into it and I forgot the question. But I appreciate that so much, because I think that people want to jump to like that it's negligent, and they're not even curious about what are you doing on the other end. And that's way more client-centered, to have a plan in place ahead of time that we both consent to, that we worked on collaboratively, that we're going to enact. It's actually very similar to safety planning, but the only difference is kind of in the system that we're in now. There's like a very rigid way to safety plan, and then at the end we have the like, in order to keep our license, we have to kind of betray you. At the end of the day, you could tell us you don't want it, and we're still going to do X, Y, and Z. And that's really coming from a selfish space of covering our asses.
It's liability. It's not client-centered at all. And if folks say that, correct.
Like I was just having this conversation with another person about like how social work, and I feel like specifically like social work versus like LMFT or other licensures like are really like liability heavy. I just came from like a conference where all they talked about was ethics. All they talked about was, you know, liability. And I was like, this has nothing to do with it. A, it's a sea of white women in the room. And so that's one thing. B, I feel like, and to your point, like Black folks, other folks of color, queer folks are all very relational. And so as a therapist, like I want to be relational with them, and, you know, calling CPS or calling the police literally disrupts that and interrupts that. And so to that point, I'm kind of wondering, you know, self-disclosure is kind of one of those things that is they talk about in grad school. They talk about is like one of the paramount things and pillars of therapy. And I've also kind of heard and talked with other clinicians about how that's also how you build therapeutic relationships, sometimes using self-disclosure and also being vulnerable with your clients. And so I'm wondering, for you as a sex worker and also working with other sex workers, how does that work for you? Kind of how much do you feel comfortable disclosing or not?
Yeah. So almost all of my clients know that I'm a sex worker and seek me out because I'm a sex worker. So we could maybe start with that part of the conversation, which is I don't show up in those spaces disclosing much, because if people follow my Twitter, they know me. They know a lot about me. And so I don't need to do any disclosure. However, what it looks like in the space is them being able to come to session and say, I saw this trick and I did this and I'm so excited, or I danced and I made this much money, or like, oh, you know, and so talking about their lives fully and authentically, and knowing that they will be seen by me in a way that makes them feel affirmed. So it doesn't so much show up as like me disclosing like, oh, I did this and this and this. They can find that out on their own. It more so shows up that they are comfortable enough to be who they are in session without being concerned that I'm going to respond and be like, you're a victim, we need to get you out, or how do we, you know, whatever the fuck. And then for non-sex worker clients, it's similar concept. Even if they're not sex workers, they still, because they know me, they can show up in the space and talk about whatever their concerns are, or talk about times that they've done really dumb bitch things, and times that they have experienced sexual activity that they like were proud of or weren't so proud of, in ways that I know that they wouldn't have been able to do that with other therapists. So I think there's that. And then there's the other half of the conversation, which is when I have clients who don't know me and navigating disclosure there. And I don't go into sessions. I mean, I put on everything that I am a sex worker. And then if folks want to ask more questions, they can. But otherwise, particularly with people who don't personally know me, like as in follow my social media, it doesn't really show up much. And I only do disclosure if it feels right for the session and for, I would never disclose anything for the sake of my own desire to disclose it. It would only be if it fuels the conversation with the client in a therapeutic way. Does that make sense? So if we're having a moment where maybe they're having difficulty sharing a thing and I want to model, maybe I'll disclose a thing. Or if it's like, if I know if I share this thing, they will feel aligned in identity. So let me share it so that they can better express that identity for themselves, you know. So it's only if it is relevant to the client. I wouldn't disclose anything. And it doesn't feel necessary to disclose things that are just like, I want to share this.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. As a reverse, when you've been a client before, have you ever felt judged by your therapist when you talked about working as a sex worker and those kinds of things?
So I'm really lucky that in my like adult sex worker life, I've only had one therapist, and I've had her for like 7 years. And
I've had one for 5. When you find your therapist, that's your therapist.
That's my bitch. That's my bitch.
My bitch. No, for real.
And I'm
like, yeah, I don't even know if she knows what sex work is, but she obviously knows that I'm a sex worker and I talk about sex work. And I think I said to her even recently, like, I don't really know how much you know about when I'm talking about whatever I'm talking about, because we mostly do EMDR. And so if you're familiar with EMDR therapists are mostly holding space. They're not asking questions. They're not doing any analyzing. They're not doing any judgment. So it actually works out perfectly for someone who is not super well versed in an identity, because it doesn't really require you to know much. But even when we're just like chit-chatting or whatever, she just listens and is supportive, and that's enough. And she is, and I think the other, just to like shout out to my therapist, the other important thing about her is she's so regulated. And so even if she, like, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's like she's just here with you. And this is a skill that I'm working on. Like she'll just look at you and she just like breathe, and it's calm, and then you feel calm because she's calm. So it's also like this thing where she focuses more on being a human with me rather than like sex work, I don't know what that is, or politics, tell me, I don't know. And she's not even there. She's like, doesn't give a fuck about that. She's like, I'm here with you in this moment. We're breathing. I'm here with you. So she's a bad bitch. I don't even know what the original question was, but shout out to her.
It don't matter. It's interesting.
You got to put your therapist on a pedestal, because baby, I'm not getting through without her right now.
Period. I love her.
Oh, I was gonna say I've been lucky to have the same therapist for 5 years, and we actually also do EMDR. She holds a lot of space for me. Those sessions are, I think, exhausting, but also filling in an odd way. Yeah. Right? But I think that's my question. Never mind.
Well, shout out to EMDR too, because that's an incredible modality. And I think, did I do EMDR first? No, I did my internship at a trauma center, and I learned how to do TIR, and that's what taught me about trauma, because we don't fucking learn shit about trauma in grad school. So I learned about that modality, and then I started seeing my therapist who does EMDR, and I did EMDR, and I was like, bitch, this is amazing. So now I do EMDR with my clients, because I understand that when folks come to therapy, and I literally just had this conversation the other day with another clinician talking about doing like CBT and shit, and no shade to CBT clinicians, like whatever, do your thing. However, and maybe not but people who are coming to you with unresolved trauma, unresolved stress, they don't like, no shade, but
here.
Yeah, telling them like, okay, let's do thought stopping, or like, that's a cognitive distortion. No, we need to process the trauma. We need to get folks to be connected with their body. What are the body sensations? What's going on? Like, it's just, I don't know. So shout out to EMDR, because that's an incredible modality that allows people to actually process trauma and actually feel better, and not just try to positive affirmation their way out of being fucking traumatized.
Well, I think what you're getting to too is like do it like body work, somatic work, which we talk about and like love and like even in our friendship talk about all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But like I've never done EMDR at that pause when I was like 7. I think my mom had me do it for some like innocuous reason. I don't even remember why. But like shout out to Janet. But like now I do a lot of, my therapist will do like a lot of brain spotting. She's a certified like brain spotting therapist, which I really want to get into. And it's kind of, it's not like EMDR with the eye movements, but it's just a lot of like keeping your eyes in a very specific place and just noticing where that brain spot, like what comes up for you. And it's been really transformational with me. And I've like started doing more of that with my clients of just like keep your eyes there, just notice what's coming up for you. And with my trauma clients, that's been like a transformational. And I think to your point too, Raquel, is like when people feel hesitant about therapy, it's often like the narrative part. Like it's talking, like I have to like talk about this. I don't want to talk through this shit. I don't want to hash this out. And I feel like if people knew there were more modalities that were body centered or like you don't even have to speak, you know, there's art therapy, there's all these things that can also be like short term. I feel like that would turn on more people just to try like different, just to try therapy too. Like you don't have to just go and like spill the beans to a therapist necessarily without.
Well, I think CBT too, right? I use a lot of, I guess, CBT tools. I don't really call it those things because I work with families and kids, and I work in inpatient. So it's just like so much trauma. And a lot of my work is getting families to understand how that's impacting their child's behavior. Like, actually, you don't have a bad kid, and here's all the dysfunction that's creating this. And here's how trauma actually presents, looks like ADHD, but it's your kid doesn't have ADHD, right? And all of these different things and modalities. But one thing to CBT, I will say that I dislike is that if you're not bringing in the perspective of how the system is impacting what you're thinking about yourself and how you're feeling, you're gaslighting. You're telling your client if you thought differently, interacting with racism, misogyny, homophobia wouldn't impact them. And that's absolutely not true.
Not true.
Correct.
And it's like you're playing a part, the rest of the world is telling, no, just do this. You know, like we talk about this, like self-care your way out of like your harmful ass, white ass workspace. Like that's not going to happen. You're just going to go back in and feel more like re-traumatized. And so I think we've gotten a lot of pushback online about this. I think of people like not understanding why the systems piece is so important, and especially talking about with like specifically Black and brown and queer clients, like you kind of have to tell them it's not you. It's actually just like your fucked up family or your fucked up partnership or your fucked up workspace. Like,
or how about just the amount of stress you're taking in throughout the day, right? Like all of the
what
things.
Has the pushback been?
The pushback has been that we're victim mentality. We're victims, and that like we're not taking accountability for our own kind of mental health.
If you look at our comments, people are like irate that we're even naming this. Like they're pissed.
Speaking of that, the last time we were supposed to meet, there was a social media ban that occurred. And if you could talk a little bit more about kind of like why you think there was so much pushback to you having a conversation about not being licensed.
Yeah, I mean, just for starters, the internet is an interesting place. And I would say I have an interesting relationship to the internet because over the 10 years that I've been online, it's either people love me or they hate me. And when they hate me, they fucking hate me. And I'm totally fine with that. But that has been like an experience that it's not new to me at all. And then so I recently I made a TikTok and just started dabbling with making content there and talk very openly. I think, let me put a pin in that. Talking very openly just about myself, that I'm a sex worker, talking about therapy, talking about that therapists are cops and whatever else. And what I was going to come back to that I was going to say, put a pin in is I forget that the things that I talk about and think are provocative because it's just my thoughts. But then I'm always reminded when I am perceived and get feedback from like the real world, because the real world is like, what do you mean? So I think it honestly started with that. Like I did a therapists are cops thing, and then that kind of went viral, and all of the white therapists were like, what? I'm a hell. And it's like, shut the fuck up. You're a fucking cop. And then it kind of turned into, so what do you do? And then so I was like, oh, I'm unlicensed by choice. And so what that looks like for me is kind of what we just talked about. I do it because these are my identities. I do it because I'm trying to serve the communities that I serve in a particular way. I have alternatives to creating support plans, et cetera, et cetera. And then kind of talking through the emotional politic and the abolitionist politic behind suicidality as a choice of autonomy, that an abolitionist politic means moving at slow paces. So people's knee-jerk reaction to, well, if a child is being abused, we need to remove them. Well, we remove them and put them into another system that's going to abuse them. So it may not actually be the best decision. And I understand it's really hard to leave a child in this situation. And if we give this family more resources, that may be helpful. And also, we can't always fix everything, and that doesn't mean we need to put them in another situation that's harmful. So it's like there's a lot of emotional pieces, and I think all related to abolition, that people get really triggered by. And then there's this whole other piece, and I think this is probably more to the point with this particular incident, that when I say to clinicians that I'm unlicensed by choice, they get really triggered because of what they believe about themselves and how they understand their positionality as a licensed counselor or clinician or whatever. And so essentially what happened is I started talking about all of this, and it went viral, and someone put it on their page and talked about it at length, and kind of what's the word? Not rallied, but their followers mass reported my page. And then because I'm a sex worker, when the page got mass reported, I couldn't get it back because TikTok said I was selling pussy online, which I wasn't. So so yeah, and but that's although that was a frustrating situation, it is not uncommon, I think, for me generally, and also for folks who are talking about issues that are not like cool yet. And I think it's really interesting because in like 5 years or like 10 years, I think that clinicians being unlicensed or renouncing their license or working as coaches, even if they have a therapy or social work background, or just the conversation generally about how harmful mandated reporting is for families, how harmful involuntarily hospitalizing people, all of that, and just mental health generally being horrific as a system. I think those are going to be more commonplace conversations, and it'll be interesting to see who talks shit about me is going to be on that bandwagon, because of course, once it's cool, it's going to be like, oh yeah, I've always believed in this. And it's going to be like, bitch, actually, you were talking shit about me when I talked about it, but now all of a sudden you want to be on a bandwagon. So we'll see. So it's, yeah, I'm
going to be at home enraged when everybody's celebrating the blonde, skinny white woman who talks about it. And takes it as their own. It takes it as their own idea, and that they've been at it. I'm going to be angry.
Yeah, but no, there are communities, there are people, there are therapists, there are social workers who are doing this work right now.
I think it's really important to name too, just for everybody else that'll be watching, that you're, I'm sure, unable to charge as much as somebody who's licensed. I'm sure you, because your experience, are able to charge what you want to charge, and you get who you get, and you're talented. But starting out, like being unlicensed, you're taking a huge pay cut. So it is like you really are standing in your morals and values. You really are, as if you're doing that as a therapist.
Standing on
it's interesting because I guess I'm very privileged, or not I guess, I know I'm very privileged because I am a sex worker. When I graduated with my master's, I was just like, I'm not going to start doing therapy until I can do therapy at a place I want to, or at my own place. And so I had, my supervisor was one of my professors. So and supervisors are expensive and whatever. Anyway, so I just was paying her to be my supervisor and just started seeing clients on my own. And then I opened up ZEP, and I'm seeing clients through there as well. But just recently, I decided that I was going to work at an actual place because I want to kind of expand my feelers to other communities, and work with, I don't know. I think I'm maybe bored because it's not like I need it, but I was just like, this year, I was just like, I want to see, anyway, the point is, bitch, I applied and I'm a registered intern, technically, right? Like I'm a registered intern, but I've been doing this for 5 years. And they're not paying shit. And I was like, damn, this is bad. Because for my personal, for like my out-of-pocket personal sessions, I charge $150, between $99 and $150 typically. And then sliding scale, if people really, I go down as low as like $40 and $50 and $30. But mostly it's like $150, and that's what I was used to, and that's, I'm thinking that's normal, bitch. No. And they're like, they told me $30 And I was like, y'all are paying registered interns $30. Bitch, we live in Florida. Even full-time, it doesn't fucking cover basic needs, bitch. And I'm like, this is why I sell pussy. And then not to go off on a tangent, but like this took me in a whole other direction, because I always think about, like, if people don't want people to be sex workers, but then they don't want to give jobs that pay enough to meet basic needs, how the fuck? So I'm glad I've been selling pussy this whole time and just doing my own thing, because if I would have came straight out of my master's and wasn't selling pussy and just did $30 an hour, what the fuck?
You should have love.
No, and
that's you're exactly right. You're exactly right that it is
it's like a labor of love. It really is in this odd, like,
it's exploitive. Like when they do that,
it is
that too. But I mean, like doing kind of the unlicensed piece is like really showing up. And we don't have our own practice yet, but that's what we'd like to get to at some point. And we very much are hoping that, like, we can charge some people, what middle class people with money, that 150 or whatever.
And each of us pay that shit.
Each of us take on some clients for completely free that are people of color, or we get successful enough that we can hire a therapist that we pay salaried, and then they see clients for free, right? Because I think it's really important to give back once you have the ability to, because a lot of the people who need it the most can't afford it. And so we have to really have that conversation.
Yep.
What I wanted to go back to, you said something really interesting about, and you should reword it because I'm not going to say it right, but essentially like suicidality as a choice. And I'd like to hear like your more thoughts about that.
Yeah. So I would like to preface this conversation with, I would like people listening to pay attention to what comes up for them when they're listening and what happens in their body when they're listening to this, and to enter this thought exercise with curiosity rather than reaction. So yeah, I think one of the big things that comes up for me when I talk about not being a mandated reporter, not involuntarily hospitalizing people, is I always get the two responses, which is, what if someone has a gun to their head, or what if a child is being violently abused? We'll save that one for a different time. But the gun to your head thing, I always find that so interesting, because going to the worst case scenario is such a white supremacist ideology, like dog whistle, because it then pigeonholes you to have to respond from a place of urgency, when that's not even what the fuck is happening. Like, I'm not saying that none of us have had clients that have had guns to their heads, but like that is most often not what's happening. So to start there is not even really realistic. But let's say that we did have a client who had a gun to their head. Let's say that we had a client who was like, I'm fucking done here. I'm done. This is it. Most clinicians, because of what we learn in grad school, because of how we're socialized, and because of how we're socialized specifically around whiteness and capitalism, that people need to be alive to work, and who we believe we are as therapists, which is we have to save everybody, and it's my fault if something goes wrong, is no, don't do it. Don't kill yourself. Like, stay here. And the reality is, and this is the thought exercise piece, is it is every person's right and decision to be here or not to be here. That's a hard truth. It can be painful if and when our friends and family die. If they die by suicide, it's horrific. It's heartbreaking. Yes. And life is fucking hard. And life does not get better for a lot of people, which is the white supremacist part, because in the white supremacist piece is, it can get better because you're white and you have access. But a lot of us are Black and brown. A lot of us are poor. A lot of us are queer and trans. A lot of us are survivors. We're living with chronic depression and we're traumatized, and it doesn't fucking get better. And that, going back to the victimization, or like the people who give you pushback about being victims, the world, the society, the container in which we exist is shitty. So even if you do all of your things to get better personally, you're still living in this world that is ongoingly harming you, that is ongoingly engaging you violently. And so it doesn't always get better for folks. And if they make the decision to leave the world, that is an autonomous decision that they get to make. And this does not mean we're encouraging people to kill themselves. That's not what this is. And again, if that feels like your knee-jerk reaction, I invite you to really reflect on that and see, why is that your response to this? So it's a hard conversation. And it's a hard, I think, thought exercise. But the reality is us as therapists, we actually don't get to decide if our clients continue to live or not. We offer supports, we offer resources, we offer alternatives, we build up all kinds of, well, what would be an objection and what's a motivation to stay and what's a future goal that we can do all of that. Ultimately, it's not up to us. We are not the authority. We do not know better than them. We don't know their lives better than they do. It is entirely up to them. So when I say suicide is about autonomy, that's what I mean. And again, invite folks to be reflective about what is going on with them rather than reactive.
I was just going to say that I think you named it already, but I'm hearing you kind of talk around this notion that there's a savior complex that a lot of therapists and people have around what our job is. And so like, it's almost like the reaction is we're not doing our job if we're not doing everything in our power to save them regardless of what they want.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
And I think it's also like, also what we've talked about is like the licensure or like liability piece of like, oh my gosh, what happens if like, you know, I didn't document this correctly, or I didn't do this correctly, or I didn't know ahead of time, or I could have done more. And it's exactly what the both of you are saying of it's kind of out of my hands. Like, and I don't work with kids or teens. I only work with adults and couples. And so for me, it's what you're saying is really resonating with me because I'm like, you're an adult in an outpatient setting. Like, I'm not gonna, a lot of my adults will say, like, are you gonna like, what do they call it? Like a grippy sock vacation. I'm like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to like this is I don't want to penalize you for having like very real, honest and painful thoughts. And I want this to be a safe space and it's not going to scare me. I tell people all the time, like your thoughts are not going to scare me or make me like have this big reaction. Like we're just going to talk about it.
95% of the kids that I work with refuse to talk about their suicidal ideation when they come up because they're afraid of being hospitalized, forcibly removed, and all of those things. And a lot of the work that I'm doing is working with clients and families to talk about like, how can we have this conversation and not have an alarmist reaction? How can your kid come tell you that they're having these suicidal thoughts? Maybe it's really coming from a centered place and that's what they really want, or maybe they're intrusive, they don't know yet. And like, how can they come talk to you about that and not have you immediately snatch them up and bring them to the ER because that's not productive?
Or be like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
But even parents will take a liability and risk approach. Well, it's not worth the liability. Okay, well, we didn't get to a different place when they got discharged 72 hours later. They're still suicidal. So now what?
Yep.
And they've lost trust in you. So how do we have that conversation?
Yep.
Absolutely. Kind of to switch gears. I saw something online about how you were talking about kind of like, or maybe a conversation along about like our favorite way to drag clients, kind of like, how do you call out clients when they don't see their own shit in a supportive way, right? And that's once you have a relationship, you build rapport, they trust you, but how do you call people on their shit?
Yeah. I mean, I think first of all that I am a therapist that people know from the beginning that I'm going to be calling you on your shit. Like, I'm not the therapist who's going to just like coddle you and validate and be like, yeah, no, I'm going to be like, actually, babes, I don't think so. So I think that, yeah, I think just for starters, like folks know my personality. And with people who don't, I try to say from the beginning, like, I'm the kind of therapist who's going to invite you to reflect on that. I'm the kind of therapist who's going to ask, can I give you some feedback? I'm the kind of therapist who's going to ask, hey, can I challenge something that you just said? And I get a sense of like how they would respond based on me even asking that preliminary kind of question. But in session, and I think we talked about this a little bit just in terms of like my therapist who's really good at just being with you in the moment. And I think that that's an important skill when it comes to challenging folks, is as opposed to, you know, sometimes therapists like get caught up in their head with like, I should say this next, and should I ask this question? And that takes you away from the ability to co-regulate with the person who's with you. And that co-regulation is also what makes it safe to challenge folks. So one, being able to just be in the moment with this other human. And then I always ask first. So kind of exactly what I said. I just heard, do you mind if I challenge something that you just said? Is it okay if I give you some feedback? Something came up for me. I'm wondering if I can share it with you. Could I give you a reflection on something that you just said? Like, that's how I kind of start those conversations. And then if someone was like, I'm like, you know what? We don't have to do it. It's okay. And then maybe a couple minutes later, they're like, actually, yeah, go ahead and tell me. Or sometimes most of my clients are just like, go ahead. What is it? Tell me. And then it's like, oh yeah, this is really helpful. Thank you. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think it's like, but I'm also, and maybe this is actually another piece, is I'm not afraid of confrontation. And I think a lot of folks are very conflict averse generally, and that includes therapists. So attempting to do confrontation, I think that also has a negative connotation, because when I say confrontation, I mean to confront something rather than confrontation as like beef, bitch, we're about to fight in here. So I think that that's an important piece too, is therapists getting comfortable with the idea of confrontation as in to confront something, but also with conflict, because sometimes when you confront something, even if you invite first, even if you ask first, maybe you get a response that's not open. Maybe you get a response that does create conflict. But the anchor there needs to be, you as a therapist are not being personally attacked. This is not personal to you, unless it is personal, and then that's separate, and we could talk about that too. But it's not personal to you, and so your role in that moment is to model with them how to do conflict. It's not to be like, well, why did you say whatever the fuck? Like, don't respond weird. And so, yeah, I think maybe that's another piece, is like, if therapists are uncomfortable with conflict, it might be hard to challenge, to call folks out on their shit, because that can feel like conflict and perhaps can turn into conflict. So you have to be prepared for that.
When you talk about it being sorry, you can go.
No. Go
when you talk about, there was a time earlier in the thing where you called your work your ministry. And I think that's one of the distinctions, right? Is like when you see it as a ministry versus a job, because when you talk about a job, you're talking about professionalism and the way that you should be treated and bringing professionalism into session, right? There's ways that you are professional, but I think we're talking about it in like a relational sense. And so I'm a very relationship-based therapist. I do a lot of co-regulation with my clients. I'm all and I love confrontation. I feel like that's one of the points. And sometimes I will actually kind of poke a button a little bit with my teens, right? Because they're a little closed in, and get them to come up with that anger reaction and model that, like what a safe adult would do in response to your anger. I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to let you be disrespectful, but I'm also not going to like police your language or how you talk to me in this moment, right? Like we have respect in our relationship, and like I want to be authentic, right? And that's part of authenticity. Is being there, being present. And then when you talk about people being in their mind about what to say, people do that all the time. You're right. Yeah, you're not present. It's a vulnerability piece, being willing to say the wrong thing or not have the perfect response when that person's done talking. That's part of being present.
Yes. And it's okay to not know what to say. Like I say this to people sometimes, I don't know what to say now.
I say that
like I literally say that. Like I don't really know what's next.
Yep.
And or be awkward in silence. Like I'm just like, okay.
That's authentic. And I think the piece that you both are getting at too is that people kind of crave this. Like the directness that you give, it's also a kindness. Like you're just telling them when maybe nobody else in their life, you're like, I don't know if that's like a great decision. We can talk about that. But like, I don't know how that would make the other people in your life feel if you did that. Or just holding up them. And people will like eat that up. And so when you're saying like you're holding kindness for them, you're holding warmth for them, you're building on the relationship that you already have, they have trust there. And so they're kind of like, if you were to just coddle them, they're like, that's all you got. Like that's all you're giving to me. I'm like, I want the real feedback. And I know I'm like that as a client. And I find that like I had a couples client the other day, and I got into it with one of the partners, not into it, but like I was like, nah, like you can't do that to them. Like that's not what we're gonna do. We're not gonna do that in this therapy space. And we just kind of like had a little like tete-a-tete. But we talked about it during the session of like, I want you to know I'm not angry with you, right? Me telling you this is just feedback and I'm being direct. And they're like, no, I actually really like it. And they named that like, it felt good for them to know that we can have this, and that I, as a therapist, but also as a person, like I'm not going to leave them just hanging. I'm not going to take it away or like the relationship away. And then we can have a hard moment and I'm just going to be fine. Like I can take that. And so it was also like a building moment of, oh wait, this is how also a relationship can look. It's like, and just go on from it.
Yes,
absolutely. And I also think that there are lots of clients who don't fucking like that, who don't like to have direct feedback, who do not like when you put a mirror to them. And that is sometimes when I have personal feelings, because depending on how long that goes on, I sometimes worry about, well, what are we doing here? Because if part of therapy, from my perspective, is that I'm able to give you feedback that your friends and family aren't, because the intention is to raise your self-awareness and then begin to move through some of this shit. So if you're just coming in and you're wanting to say your way and this is this and, you know, whatever, what is the utility of the space? What do you want this space to be used for? How can the space be productive for you? So I think that there's that. And I also want to say that, like, sometimes therapists, I think, get a bad rep because we do this. And I also know that, like, therapists generally are terrible. So I don't trust that therapists are out here like doing this in a skilled way. But only speaking for myself, this is part of like what it is sometimes. And so when I see like tweets where people are saying like mean things their therapist has said to them, sometimes in my head, I'm like, well, it may need to have been said. Now, again, I don't trust that most therapists are out here doing it with tact, but, and that's kind of the utility of therapy sometimes, is someone being like, babes, what the fuck are you doing?
But what's the feedback though to somebody who would push back on that and be like, I just want to come to therapy to vet and be validated?
Wrong therapist.
I mean, my personal response would be, and that's totally fine, I'd love to give you a referral to a therapist who focuses on that.
Yeah.
But that's not what the fuck I do. And I even if I'm getting paid, I'm not interested in doing that every session.
I talk about that in my supervision a lot. Of, I think folks come to therapy almost as like a thing to check off their list. Oh, I'm in therapy. Like, therapy. Like, I'm doing the thing that I'm supposed to do. And I have to talk a lot about like, but like, why are you here? I say this a lot to people. Like, it's not my job to come up with the questions, to like pull.
Right. I'm not doing more work than you.
I'm not doing more work from you. This is your time. This is your 53 minutes like that I'm giving you to like, yes, I want you to vent and process. And also like, I'm relational. I want to like make meaning, do all these things. Like, I don't want to do just like psychodynamic. I'm going to sit here in silence and be like a piece of paper for you to just.
Well, there's a lot of people pleasing too. I think a lot of therapists get into therapy to make people feel better, which to them means happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, not my job.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, which is also why I talk a lot about how therapy is not an appropriate resource for abusers and for couples who are experiencing abuse, because therapists mostly validate people's feelings and listen to people's versions of stories and believe them and don't challenge them, which just further fuels and solidifies and makes abusers more sophisticated. So that's a whole separate conversation. But yeah,
I actually hear your feedback and take on like what should be happening then with abusers, because I also like I don't think I've ever knowingly worked with someone who is abusing another person, but I guess I really don't know, to be honest. They could be being dishonest. Okay.
Yeah.
But like what would be, because the pushback I would feel, my gut reaction to that is, okay, then what should we do? Because they do need support, help, direction. So what does that look like? Definitely not couples therapy, 100% not, but from an individual, what should we be doing?
Yeah, so I have a couple of things. I think the first thing is, whenever I'm thinking about abuse generally, my focus is always on survivors. So it's not even really on the abusers, but I will comment on that in a second. So we can do work with survivors that meets them where they're at. We can make sure that we're working with the communities of survivors to make sure that they have support teams, so that they have people to call when they need things, so that they're all also not only relying on us. We can help them with basic needs if they need childcare, figuring out resources for them. So anything like revolving around survivors. We can also help them try to come up with, if they're interested in, what accountability might look like, what justice might look like, what kind of action, if any, they might want to take, and how to engage their community in that as well, and working with their community to do that. And then when it comes to abusers specifically, when I say that therapy is not an appropriate resource for abusers, I mean specifically around the goal of stopping them to be abusive. So it cannot be, you should go to therapy because you're abusive and I want you to stop being abusive. No, it can be, you're abusive, go to therapy, and then the therapy can be that the abuser is working through their trauma. They can do any regular therapeutic shit, but the goal cannot be, we're doing all of this to decrease trauma. And the reason is because being traumatized is not the cause of abuse. So the reason that people are abusive is not because they have an unresolved childhood of trauma. It's not because they have anger management problems. It's none of that. And we know that because abusers go to psychotherapy and don't stop being abusive. And because many of us have traumatic childhoods and don't go on to be abusers. So it is fine, I think, for abusers, people who have been abusive, however you want to phrase it, because I know some people are like, person first language, but I don't give a fuck about abuse. I mean, honestly, whatever. Anyway, similar to cishet men, abusers, not my ministry, but I do speak on this with generally. So yeah, going to therapy for the perspective of therapy, working through trauma, fine. When it comes specifically to decreasing or diminishing abuse, the appropriate resources would be an abuse counselor. So this is someone who works with abusers and survivors/victims specifically and is trained in that, because therapists do not have comprehensive training on dynamics of abuse to be able to work with abusers from that capacity. Another thing could be working with abusers and survivors potentially, but not really in a therapeutic space, but to figure out how to get their community to work together to hold the abuser accountable. And this can be co-creating what consequences look like. This can be figuring out and helping strategically plan how the follow-through might look. And that's really that, because the reality is the only person who can change their abusive behaviors is the abuser. And the only way that can really happen is if they intrinsically want to do that. It doesn't matter what fucking resources, it doesn't matter what therapy, it doesn't matter what accountability, fucking anything that we do, if they are not sincerely interested in changing long term. And I mean, this can't be 6 months later they're cured. No, the assessing whether an abusive person has changed takes at least 5 years. We need ongoing. So this is another like abolitionist thing where it's like it's not an overnight thing.
Go ahead.
No. That's it.
I know I've heard you talk about like power, like, and for abusers, it's like their power, like it's you said it's not that they have anger issues, it's not that they like don't like you, or it's that they have like a intrinsic like power structure inside of them that like they need, like this is their belief about the world, this is the paradigm that they're dealing from. And so when you talk about like not going to therapy to discuss that, could they go to therapy necessarily to like work to dismantle that thought system, or does that feel like it wouldn't be helpful as well?
I'm really, really, really weary about sending abusers to therapy with the goal of decreasing their abuse.
Can I ask this is not a great question, so you can rephrase the question for me, but like, why is somebody abusive if it's not because of their background? I know that, right? I've actually had like a significant amount of childhood trauma, and I would say that it made me more compassionate. So I don't think that that's like an excuse, but that's an excuse that an abuser would use, right? And so like, to talk, I guess, more plainly, why do you think people are abusers?
Yeah. So what informs or what causes abuse is distorted belief systems, distorted belief systems around power, distorted belief systems around anything. It just depends on what the situation is. And we can give an example paired with the pattern of the behavior that they act on. So this can look like with parents, for instance, the distorted belief being, you are my child and I own you. I can do whatever I want. You need to listen to me because I'm superior. And that might not even be a conscious thing that they say to themselves. For lots of parents, it is. But that's the belief at the core. And that paired with yelling at them, smacking them around, spanking them, that is what informs someone to be abusive.
That is the perfect example that hit so much. You snapped, yeah. Yeah. So
the question was, can an abuser work through that in therapy? And so I say I'm weary, and there's a couple of reasons. One is because I don't think that most therapists are equipped to tease that out of someone, and most therapists don't understand what informs abuse. And an abuser might go to therapy and say and pull the sympathy card, oh, I was abused as a child, and the therapist is going to be like, oh, I want to validate you, I want to, and then they're not challenging them, because no, it's not because you were abused as a child. It's because you are making this decision based on a set of beliefs that you have that doing this is okay. And most therapists don't have the skills, the wherewithal, the understanding to do that. So it then makes space for an abuser to be validated, which then just makes them a more emboldened abuser. So it creates more harm. And then the other thing is, I don't think, or rather it is rare that abusers, people who are abusive, sincerely want to stop being abusive, and going into a space where they already don't want that and then they are also validated just fuels the fucking fire. Because the reality is our culture is set up to reward abusers, and to encourage abusers. I mean, if we want to think about like the parent line of logic, the entire system of our fucking world is set up to dehumanize children. It is set up to reward parents whose children obey them and are submissive, essentially. And so it's like a multi-tiered thing. And I really only think the only time it would be appropriate to send an abuser to therapy for the purpose of decreasing their abuse. Okay, and this is again separate from like you should go to therapy to resolve your childhood trauma, or you got in a car accident and it was traumatizing, you can't drive a car now, but like that's fine. But for the intention of decreasing abuse, I really think that should be the last resort, and only if you find a therapist who has a lot of knowledge about dynamics of abuse, and has skills with calling people on their shit. Because that's what you have to do with abusive people. It cannot be validate. It has to be, no, that's wrong. That is not correct. And here's why. And you know this. Are you going to own up to this, or are you not? It's not like regular therapy. So this is why abuse counselors are more equipped to do that work.
I can't imagine that somebody with that paradigm and mindset would go into therapy, be challenged, especially by someone who looks like us, and won't come back. And also, take that in, want to be back, see that as a space that's valuable. Like, why now, right? So like, I hear you in that, and like, you've been so generous with this hour, so I want to give you your time so you can go back to sleep. But my last question for you is, what drew you to our podcast? How did you even see us? You're so much bigger.
I know.
We were like, wait, what?
How savage is the DM? What?
I mean, I don't know. Y'all are Black femme therapists, and
that's fine. No, I was curious if it was like an identity thing, of just like, I was curious if it was because of our identity, but I want to say
yeah. I mean, I low key want to recruit every Black femme therapist to Zeb. Yeah. So I'm always like, especially if they're also sex workers. But so I'm always like just peeking around, and it was just aligned. It's community.
I was just gonna say, you seem like you create a lot of community, which I really love.
Which I love.
You're so community centered. It's really great.
It is great. I have one more kind of question.
Okay, go ahead.
Just to kind of wrap it up, and then I promise I will let you go sleep and do all that awesome stuff. Where would you like to see like the field of like mental health or like therapy specifically like go in the next like, I don't know, 5 years, whatever you want to say? Like, what would you like to see like come out of community spaces? What would you maybe specifically with sex workers? Like, what would you like to see like the market kind of do for sex workers or just other marginalized communities? What would you see as like movement forward?
Yeah, I think I definitely dream that clinicians and therapists and all kinds of providers in the mental health field move towards either being unlicensed or revoking their license or renouncing whatever phrase we want to use, practicing outside of their license, and or practicing in a way that actually sincerely centers their clients. And working towards disrupting and dismantling their own beliefs around what it means to be licensed and the power that gives them, and the power that they believe that they have with that, and shifting into how can we actually help clients in ways that meet them where they're at and meet the needs that they have, rather than work from a system that we were taught that we are like, oh, I have to do it this rigid way. So I think, a combination of folks like being rebellious, being reflective about what comes up for them when they think about being rebellious, being curious and wanting to learn new ways to do things. And
it honestly sounds like you want people to do what everybody's claiming they're already doing besides
but nobody's actually fucking doing that.
Nobody's actually doing it, but you want
nobody's doing that.
You want people to actually be self-reflective. You want them to know their biases that they bring in the room, and you want them to choose clients that
actually, not bullshit, like actually.
Yeah. What do you think about therapists who've never been in therapy?
Yeah, I don't. What?
All right, that's it. Thank you so much for your time.
This was fucking fantastic.
This was fucking fantastic. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited that I was your first guest.
All right. Thank you. Bye, Raquel.
Bye.